me to introduce our next speaker. It's architect Mark Ong. Mark Dennis Ong. Prior to graduating with honors at the University of Santo Tomas, Mark spent his summer holidays on internship stints with Jose Scholing and Associates and Palafox Associates. After graduation, he worked in the offices of the late National Artist for Architecture, Francisco Bobby Manyosa, as well as Lord Calma Design Associates. He became a licensed architect in 2003. In 2004, Mark received an ASEAN Graduate Scholarship to pursue his master's degree in urban design from the National University of Singapore, where he graduated with the Singapore Institute of Architects Prize. Today, he is an associate director for P&T Consultants Pte Ltd, a 150-year-old award-winning and multidisciplinary architecture and engineering consultancy with projects in over 70 cities around the world, which are designed across 13 offices all over Asia, including Singapore. Since joining P&T in 2006, he has been involved in a broad range of projects that are diverse both in scale and typology, from master planning to the architectural design of mixed-use and residential developments, both for the private and public sector. Apart from his work in Singapore, he has also done projects in Malaysia, Myanmar, Philippines, Vietnam, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and India. Apart from his work at P&T, he has also given talks and workshops both in Singapore and abroad on topics such as housing, urbanism, and design. Welcome our next speaker, architect Mark Dennis Ong.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Okay, let me just share. Yeah. Let me just share my screen. Huh? Okay.
Yeah, you can start now.
Okay. Kita na, no? Yeah. Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So today I've been asked to share to you guys about international practice, planning and architecture. Particularly, I'm sharing from the perspective of Singapore. I thank UAP Metro for this opportunity to take advantage in a way of the unique position that I find myself today. As someone who will always see ideas about architecture and planning through the lens of someone who was born, raised, and educated and started his architectural career in the Philippines, but has spent most of his career and adult life in Singapore. So when we think about planning and architecture ideas, I'd like to kind of like tackle them across varying scales. So these ideas I'd like to share come the scale of the city, the town, the neighborhood, and then finally at the site, building, or architectural scale. And so what I'd like to try to do today is to show how these ideas have shaped, influenced, and driven the work that we've been doing at P&T here in Singapore. And with that, I'd like to do a quick intro of P&T. So we're a firm of nearly about 2,000 staff working across 13 offices all around Asia, with projects in over 100 cities in more than 40 countries worldwide. Our firm was founded in 1868, and just 3 years ago, when we celebrated our 150th year, we celebrated with the motto, define the past, design the future, in a way, embracing our history at the same time while looking forward to the possibilities beyond. And of course, in that 150 plus years, I'm proud to say that much of the firm's work have become part of the architectural heritage in many of Asia's most important cities. Here, some of the work of the firm in the late 1800s in Hong Kong and Singapore. And if you're familiar, if you've taken a trip to Shanghai, this is the famous Bund with the works of P&T from the early 1900s to the 1930s, all the way down to modern Hong Kong, as well as modern metropolises in the Southeast Asian area like Bangkok, where our Thailand office has made quite a mark for itself. Whereas Singapore, the office itself was established in the early 70s before I was born. But even then, before then, many of the heritage buildings in Singapore were also done by P&T. So today, we are proud that we're a regular in the World Architecture List, a regular. And at the same time, of course, for natural reasons, our presence is felt the strongest in Asia. And as of late, we have built a very, very strong track record in the development and the designing of homes. So then I think with that, I'd like to start first with ideas about the city. Okay, so in talking about ideas for the city, I'd like to kind of break it down according to a few different categories. First, and when we talk about the city, I'd like to go through a few things. First is how we define the city. I'd like to talk about my dirty D word. Then third, since we're doing all of this build right now in the Philippines, it's good to ask build what. And in the identity of the city, I think I'd like to touch a little bit about heritage and identity. Okay, so to start with, I'd like to do a quick comparison between Singapore, okay, and Manila, okay. And I'd like to start by asking a question that I get asked all the time. And the question is this: totoo ba na ang Singapore ay kasing laki lang ng Quezon City? So the answer is no. Singapore is bigger than the entire Metro Manila. And when people ask me this question, what I in fact tell them is that you just take Metro Manila, you rotate it 90 degrees, and you get something that is of a compatible size to Singapore. But if you add parts of Laguna, Cavite, Bulacan, and so forth, where many people who commute to and from for work and school purposes in Manila, it will not be difficult to put together a land area, something compatible to Singapore. Singapore is nearly 720 square kilometers. It has a population of 5.7 million people. Okay, that gives you a density of about 7,900 people per square kilometer. That's a planar scale of measurement. If you reverse the math, you will get the architectural scale. That's 126 square meters per person, or the size of approximately a 4-bedroom apartment by Singapore standards. Okay. In contrast, Metro Manila is about 619 square kilometers with 12.8 million people. That gives you a density of about 20,700 people per square kilometer, or 48 square meters per person. That's by Singapore standards, a large 1-bedroom unit by Singapore property standards. I think maybe in the Q&A, Roy can give us some light on what the equivalent is of this in the various places that he's done his work in. Okay, Metro Manila, on the other hand, okay, but here's the thing. When we say Metro Manila, what we're actually talking about is Metro Manila, which is actually made up of 17 different LGUs, including the city of Manila, most of which of these LGUs are legally considered to be independent city. So Manila, as we know it today, is not a single organized city. It is a conglomeration, in fact, of 17 independent LGUs, each with their own city plans, zoning laws, etc. And so if I was going to build in a building, say in Quezon City, I need to go to Quezon City Hall. If I was going to build a building in Makati, I'd go to Makati City Hall and so forth. Okay, so each of the plans are that the architects submit are done to the individual LGUs and assessed based on what that LGU's standards are for the master plan. Singapore is actually also made up of different towns. That's the term we use here, towns. We don't use city, okay? But it is conceived as one single city made of different parts that work together, okay? So if an architect is going to build anywhere in Singapore, we do our submissions to an agency that oversees the entire city. The difference is that we do submissions to different agencies that specialize in a different aspect of the building. For example, we will go to the Urban Redevelopment Authority, who will clear us on building height, setbacks, GFA, and so forth. To get approval on refuse collection for our buildings, we will have, we have to do it with the National Environment Agency, okay? Traffic and car parking goes to the Land Transport Authority. Or for example, fire exits and so forth are assessed by the Singapore Civil Defense Force. Okay, the agencies are coordinated between themselves, and they have master plans that look at the entire city together, so that everything is completely in sync. And so, I would like to ask a question. The purpose is to avoid this. This is where what is currently being suffered right now, in my opinion, in a place like Manila, where the boundaries of each LGU are already overlapping, okay, and touching each other, and each of the different LGUs, different plans, are in many cases compete, deter, or even a detriment to the neighboring one. Basically, the cities in the different LGUs are already smelling each other's armpits and BO. So people keep saying that the problem with Manila is walang urban planning. I say meron. The problem is that there are too many of them. What needs to happen is for these plans to work together in an integrated manner. And so I will leave this topic here with a question. If all of us already think of Manila as one single city, then is it not time for it to be defined and administered as such? Iwanan ko na lang dyan. The next thing I'd like to discuss is what I like to call the dirty D word. And what is the dirty D word? The dirty D word is density. I like to joke that the word density is like the word sex. They have a lot in common. Fundamentally, they are good things. But if they are misused or abused, the outcomes are very, very perverse. And at 48 square meters per person, it is clear that there's a lot of work needs to be done to improve how density is managed in Manila. Large chunks of the most important sections of the city are carved out as gated enclaves. Locking out most for a select few in what Michelle Yeoh's character in Crazy Rich Asians referred to as our kind of people. A functional city should not be about low density for the haves and high density for the have-nots. So for me, it is heartening to see positive things, demonstrations of good quality, high density developments for our downtowns, and I hope to see more. Over the past 15 years, Singapore has also sought to create a more vibrant downtown, which for many, many years have been left as a CBD purely for office purposes. Okay, by introducing residential sites to help maintain the vibrancy of the downtown core during both day and night. So we found ourselves with the opportunity to work on such a project through Sky Suites in Anson. It's a 72-story residential tower right at the heart of Singapore's downtown. And for us at PNT, it became a question of how do we create a high-quality living environment in a hyper-dense context. So what we did was, at street level, the tower actually sits on a car park podium, okay, which hugs the street. And what we did was we carved out one of the podium's corners to create a welcome space at ground level. And above, we made the critical decision to rotate the tower. So the tower is rotated at a different axis from that of the podium. And we did it for the purpose of three key objectives. The first was to give the tower's residential units a north-south orientation, no direct or afternoon or morning sun. And then second, to tilt the views of the tower to face the best views. And the third is to give the tower a stronger presence on the main road. So if you take a look at the 3D diagram here, this is the main road. The tower's access is to a secondary road, and we tilted it so that it can be a little bit more prominent as well in the main road. Now, because of the tower's height, it's 72 stories, we designed each tower, the whole tower in section. So the whole first story is basically retail and F&B at the street in a drop-off porch, okay? And then at the amenity deck, we basically fit in as many amenities as we could. So we were able to fit in a 50-meter Olympic length pool. We were also able to fit in a tennis court, okay? And then as you go up, we basically start to introduce things like gardens, lounges, jacuzzi, spa, and basically all sorts of public areas for the residents to enjoy. Okay. And on top, we clipped this flying saucer-shaped viewing deck to allow residents a 360-degree view of the city, which is the perfect spot to watch the fireworks on National Day, on New Year's Eve, or on Formula One weekend at Marina Bay, or even some of the attractions in Sentosa Island. So it was a project for us that was about finding the right balance of providing an enriching living experience on a human scale for the residents, but also about how such a large and tall architectural object behaves while it is around its neighbors. Okay, so the next thing about the city is build, 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 build what? We're now in this mode of build, 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 right? So we're building roads, bridges, airports, and so forth. So I would also like to make a few suggestions of what else we can build. And here's my first suggestion. I think we should build more parks. And I'm not just talking about building parks that tourists will visit, like Gardens by the Bay or Botanic Gardens or Bakrichi Reservoir we have. I'm not just talking about parks like this. I'm also talking about parks integrated with affordable housing neighborhoods. So this is Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park, right next to a public housing estate. Okay, and it's fitted with playgrounds, outdoor and fitness equipment for adults and the elderly. And what's happened is that these parks are now a regular weekend destination for families. Who says that every weekend must be spent in an air-conditioned shopping mall? Now, this is a pretty unique one. This is Southern Ridges Park. You can observe, if you look at this aerial photograph, that it is actually functions as a green barrier or a buffer between the higher lying areas here above and the lower lying areas that are close to the sea. Geographically speaking, it is actually the slope on a series of hills. And then the footpaths themselves are just sitting on stilts to create a rainforest canopy walk experience in this sliver of site between warehouses in different housing estates. In the Philippines, it's these kind of areas na di natin mapag-iwanan. We just have to build subdivisions like this, in places like this. And then later on is the poor residents who have to suffer the consequences later on with flooding and all of these issues. And I think it is areas like this in our city that we should just leave for nature to take its course, and we can build a few things here and there and turn them into public amenities for residents to enjoy. Parks can also be used as a tool to enhance a city's biodiversity. In 1986, the Singapore government actually built a highway through the city's nature reserve, which effectively cut it in two. So nearly 30 years later, they came back and they literally built a bridge for animals. It's 50 meters wide, carrying 1.5 meters of soil depth, so you can allow trees to grow. And so that animals like pangolins, squirrels, and snakes can go on from one side of the nature reserve to the other. Today, the bridge looks like this. And yesterday, just last weekend, I was in a taxi, and the cab driver told me that for the animals to cross, what they did was they actually took urine samples from animals in the zoo and sprinkled it on this bridge so that animals from one side of the reserve will feel free and feel safe that this is really a place for animals and they'll just go ahead and cross. Now, why am I talking about this? These discussions on parks and public amenities remind me of one of our recently completed projects, which is the German-European International School. Okay, so the school was planned in actually just two key areas. One is a sports and recreation area, and the other one is the academic block to the west. I think the most interesting part of the way we designed the academic block is that we used a shopping center's race course plan to kind of inspire the design. Okay, and what we did was by doing that, it actually allowed us to carve out a large central atrium to create a series of courtyards. And right smack in the middle, we call this space the forum, which is the main gathering space for the children. And then the other courtyards are basically used as play areas where we basically fitted it with playground equipment suitable for each courtyard had equipment for children of different ages to kind of have that natural separation of children. Now, why am I discussing this project while talking about building more parks? And here's an interesting story. When we completed this project, but before it was handed over, we organized an Archi tour for PNT staff to tour the school. And one of my office mates, a colleague named Abhishek, turned up late for the tour, and he arrived on site. He was sweaty, he was breathing heavily, and I basically asked him a rhetorical question. What, you ran here from home, is it? And to my absolute shock, he said, yes, I got lost a bit, but that's why I'm late. Now, here's why this is a shock. To give you guys an idea, he jogged basically 11.8 kilometers from his house to the school. For reference, that's longer than the distance from Rizal Park to Quezon Circle. On hindsight, the thought of somebody jogging 11.8 kilometers would only probably shock an overweight person like myself. But what is impressive was how the city enabled him to do this. Because all of the city's parks are linked together by a network of park connectors, ensuring that every single home has access to green space. And it doesn't just end there, though. With schools like GESS, this is an exclusive international school, opening their doors to local community groups for the usage of their facilities, including their swimming pool and sports fields. In Singapore, the public schools also open their school gymnasiums for people to play basketball and badminton and so forth. By doing this, the entire island, the entire city effectively becomes a single giant fitness circuit. Okay. So the next thing about build, build, world, to introduce the next idea on what to build next, I'd like to start by bastardizing a question that I heard from an Australian architect many years back. I apologize that I don't remember his name, but I remember very, very distinctly the question that he asked. Which is a more sustainable mode of transport, a Prius or a Hummer? Most of us will automatically go for the Prius. But the Prius has many patented parts that come from different parts of the world to be assembled. All of the Hummer's parts, on the other hand, come from within a small number of kilometers from its factory. The Prius has a shorter lifespan, say 5 to 7 years, while the Hummer is built to last for much longer. So really, what is the more sustainable mode of transport? It was a trick question, of course. The answer is a bicycle. Joke na lang na tatak ng bicycle is Hummer. But that's the next point that I wish to make about what next to build and what next for us to aspire to build, which is a car-light society. Okay. In Singapore, we are aspiring to this as the government has already announced a zero car growth policy, which means that we are no longer allowed in Singapore to have any more cars than the number of cars and we currently in Singapore cannot be allowed to increase anymore. Because at the end of the day, this is what we are aspiring to. A developed country is not a place where the poor have cars, it is where the rich ride public transportation. The next thing we should all aspire to build are greener and smarter cities. To do that, it's important that we are greener and smarter, not just in what we build, but also in how we build. And this is where DFMA, or Design for Manufacturing and Assembly, comes in. The idea is for building construction to be less like this, where you have hundreds of thousands or even thousands of people working under the elements, doing many things manually. And if we think about it, most construction sites today still look like this. Okay, so the idea is less of this and more of this, where we can work in safer and more controlled environments, have better quality, higher levels of productivity, and finally, less wastage. In 2012, we found ourselves with a unique opportunity to apply DFMA for the first time in a project. This is the North Hill Student Residences, the Nanyang Technological University, or NTU. The project consisted of 6 cruciform towers sitting on a podium of common facilities and amenities for the students. The site was on sloping ground, and this is where the usage of BIM as a design tool came in, building information modeling. How do we set the podium on the ground? What is the ideal platform level? So when we use BIM and we use it as a design tool, not just for documentation, we are able to get real-time information from an architectural, civil structural, and cost point of view on the implication of the different scenarios we explored. And we are able to use this information, which we get real-time, to allow and guide the client to make these sorts of critical decisions. And then what we did was we took the BIM model and then we ran it through computational fluid dynamics, or CFD, to test how the scheme also responded to things like wind flow. And thus we adjusted the plans as needed to get the optimal ventilation outcomes. When you work in BIM, it also allows you to together with your consultants, pwede kayong magkaalaman who really understands the project or not, who has errors in their drafting and who does not. And you can find these clashes, and you find them during the design stage through virtual design and construction, rather than when you find out during construction na mismo, and later on you have mag-aaway kayo on site. So for NTU, we basically also, NTU North Hill also became the first ever application of prefabricated, pre-finished volumetric construction in Singapore, or PPVC, which is a form of DFMA. Yeah. Okay. The system we used was a hybrid. The development's podium and core in purple would use conventional cast in situ concrete construction. For the typical floor, so that's typical, in purple, yan yung conventional, so cast in situ. And then in the typical floor, These would include the lift core, stairs, toilets, and the hall fellows apartments. You can see there the floor plan, everything in purple, that's conventional. Okay. But for the student apartments, we used steel PPVC. So all of these were done in steel modules. We designed the accommodation in modules with a double occupancy room designed as a combined module here, combined module of 2 single occupancy rooms. And the main consideration would be that each module would be within a certain size, so that we could fit it at the back of a truck, and when it's being transported from a barge, if the thing comes by ship, or if it comes from a warehouse, we need to transport it through Singapore's roads. We don't make it too big, so you avoid having to involve a police escort to bring the components down to the construction site. And so when you work like this, your construction drawings begin to resemble the assembly instructions of furniture. I understand that the Philippines has joined the IKEA club, so I would imagine those who have purchased their first batches of furniture in IKEA will recognize assembly instructions that resemble this. So these are the modules. When they come onto site, they're literally brought in 3-dimensionally, completely finished with windows, cladding, floor finishes, wall finishes, and so forth. Okay. They are lifted up onto place with high capacity cranes. Okay. And when they're assembled, they look like this. The project itself got quite a bit of publicity. Of course, we took that as a sign of encouragement. And finally, when we are able to finish the project, this is what it looks like. This is steel PPVC. Today, almost all PPVC projects in Singapore are done in concrete. And I will be showing you an example of these types of projects later. Okay. Now, 11% of global CO2 emissions come from building materials and construction. And if we take a look at how buildings are made the conventional way, this is roughly how it looks like. You take your materials. In the case of Singapore, we take aggregates from the Middle East or Indonesia. Okay. And then they are basically brought in by freight to Singapore. They need to be stored in warehouses, okay? Then they are transported to site, and then finally you basically piece them together on a construction site, okay? This, of course, results in things like noise and dust pollution, or you have a lot of wastage from auxiliary material, okay? Now, if you use PPVC construction, basically what you're essentially doing is you're replacing the material source with a singular overseas production process by creating the modules in one area. And then what that does, you normally get these parts made in Malaysia or in China. In the projects that we do here in Singapore, the PPVC components normally come from Malaysia or China. Okay. And then you basically still need to do all of these things. But what it effectively does is that basically it drastically reduces the amount of noise and dust pollution that you have. So it is here where the Integrated Construction and Prefabrication Hub, or ICPH, comes in. This was our opportunity at PNT to participate in the transformation of the building construction industry towards a smarter and a greener way of building. So ICPH combines a factory, this is the factory, warehousing components, as well as the corporate offices and workers' dormitories, which is here behind, into a single integrated campus. In Singapore, our equivalent to LEED is called Green Mark. Okay, buildings need to be either certified, or if you want to go for higher, you can go for a gold, or you can go for a gold plus. I'm proud to say that ICPH has achieved an even higher platform. We've achieved platinum. Thus, we've called ICPH a green building to make other green buildings. Okay. So let me just show you a quick video of what happens in this little factory. Okay. So that's what happens inside the factory. You can see all the modules NTU was done in steel. Now everything in this factory is fully automated using hoist. Everything is done casting in concrete. The modules you can see are completely done three-dimensionally. And we use gantry cranes, not too different from the ones you see in shipping, to basically transport each of the components from one part of the factory to the other. You can see here, these are three-dimensional rooms already built on a conveyor system. And the whole thing is also done, even things like tiling is all done within the same factory. So it's all done under a single roof. Structural works like caging and so forth. And this is what the warehouse looks like. So we had talked about earlier on controlling the size of the modules. So to control the size of the modules, you can see that they can also, it's almost like a library of these concrete parts. And then that's how they're basically brought on to this from here. As it comes out of the semi-outdoor space, it's actually hoisted to the back of the truck. So with ICPH, what we're essentially trying to do is to take these three parts and basically do it into a single integrated process. So thus the entire building construction industry is basically further simplified. And therefore what we're trying to do, if we take a look at the map on the left side, that's the pre-ICPH era when we try to do things in PPVC. Most of the components actually come from this part of Malaysia in Johor. And then they're basically shipped over to various construction sites all over Singapore. And as you can imagine, if you basically bring in large numbers of these types of precast modules from one part to another through very, very long roads, you will have an enormous carbon footprint. And therefore, in a post-ICPH era, once you have enough of these built, we can have a much more self-sustained building construction industry. And that's what we're trying to achieve with PPVC and ICPH. Now, when I show PPVC to people, the first thing people say is, wow, parang Lego. I do think, though, that PPVC is more similar to those battleship model kits that I used to build when I was a kid, where you have all of these pre-built parts already, pre-assembled parts. You bring it, and then you basically assemble it for your final product. There is another form of DFMA method, which is much more, in my opinion, similar to Lego. And it's called mass engineered timber. So basically what you have is you have a single material, which in this case is timber. And then you basically, it comes in various shapes and sizes. And then basically you take this and you assemble it into your final product. Now, I'll show the video. In 2014, we found ourselves with the unique opportunity to use this technology on a small building for a public housing site. It's just a drop-off porch with a residence committee center. So that's the equivalent of like a barangay hall. Okay, GFA not more than 200 square meters. And the video that you guys are watching right now is basically the 6-week span it took to build it. So you can see there, the walls, you can see the walls, the columns are all done using timber. It's still sitting on a concrete bed, okay? So even the beams, if you fast forward now, you can see the beams there. They're all also done in timber, okay? And then as you cover it up, the roof, the roof is also done in timber, but of course we have to cover it up with waterproofing, okay, before we put a proper metal roof. Sidings are also done waterproofed and so forth. So it took about 6 weeks to build this. It was almost in a way our little learning experiment using this building technology. And then a year later, we got the chance for its full application for a 5-story community center. So the brief included very long spans and high volumes to accommodate a multi-purpose hall that on a typical day, people normally book these kinds of spaces to play badminton, or sometimes people use it to hold wedding ceremonies and things like that, okay? So one of the key things for us was to be sensitive about how to apply or use the technology to the local context. Our supplier was from Europe, Austria, and we were building in a tropical context. So we took measures to ensuring that no timber members would have contact with the ground. So you can see from here, the entire first story and the basement was completely done in concrete. But because timber was also a combustible material, we also had to adapt the technology to local fire codes. So for example, all exit staircases here and in here, you could see, were also done in concrete. And so you actually had a building with a lot of interesting interfaces between this material and the structure that's in concrete. Okay, and we learned a lot of lessons. This is the building as it was coming under construction. And this is actually the first talk that I'm giving where I can show the completed photograph of the project. Previous talks, I could only give the construction photo. So we completed it thereabouts during the pandemic. Okay. So here are the spaces internally where we also try to celebrate the material. You can see that we expose the material as much as possible. This is basically that double volume long span structure that I talked about. You can see it's got retractable seats on one side because it's also used as a multi-purpose hall by the community center. Okay, so these are like technologies that we have been so-called playing around with, experimenting with, to try to build greener and more sustainable and build smarter as well here in Singapore. Okay, finally, I'd like to, on the scale of the city, I'd like to quickly touch on heritage and identity. As a kid, I used to call this the spaceship building when we would pass by it along Taft Avenue. And they tore down the High Allied building when I was in college in UST, and it broke my heart. Now, and we're seeing lots of other examples. And I think part of the reason why it hurts to see such great buildings go is because buildings are somehow tied to our identity as citizens, as inhabitants of a city, as people. And I think this is the magic of great architecture. But sometimes it's not the architecture that creates the magic. Sometimes it's the place. And every city has these places where things have grown organically. Something has unique character. It just comes out. So I'm thinking of places like Poblacion in Makati or Malate, Manila. Not many great buildings to shout about, but somehow it's the mix of people, culture, the right kind of establishments that just gives the place a very, very unique identity. And as an architect, I've always been terrified of the thought that I might do something to a place like this, and ruin it. That you just plonk some box, and as beautiful as that box might be, you might just ruin the place and suck all the magic out. And we were confronted with this challenge 2 years ago, where we were invited by a developer to participate in a land tender exercise for a site in Holland Village. I wouldn't be surprised if Roy spent a few nights out in Holland Village when he was still living in Singapore. It's a great place to enjoy a Friday night or a Saturday night out. It's got great bars, restaurants, but during the daytime, it's got a different character. So that's one of the unique things about this place. So when we were doing the proposal, so what we did was we basically looked at it. And so basically Holland Village is essentially just primarily a cluster of 2 to 3 story shop houses with a market and food center right in here. So what we did in our proposal was to basically extend the existing streets into the site. And we made each of these streets terminate into a series of open spaces. So one, we thought about it as a plaza. The other one would be a park, and then we would link it with an eternal pedestrian street. And then what we wanted to do was to replicate the scale, the proportion, and the streetscape of the existing Holland Village and extend it into the site. So what does this thing look like? So the buildings in Holland Village had this charming messiness. Each shop had its own look, character, and all of that. So if you take a look at it, they all iba-iba, not too different from, like the places I mentioned, right? And so what we wanted to do was to do something similar. You have similar scale proportions, you apply different materials, so it feels very, very rich. And what we called it a beautiful mess. And what we did was we wanted these spaces to the streets, of course, to integrate and merge landscape. And above the shop houses that we basically introduced greenery. And what we did was above all of that, because you still need to fill in all of the area requirements by the client, we basically sat all of the big items above. So the key idea was to take the vibrancy of the streets of Holland Village, and to basically apply it into our own site. Okay, and we thought about how places like the public plaza would be used in different times of one day. Okay, this day, and then at night You can basically have things like light. You can bring the food trucks in, so it becomes a much more vibrant place. The park during the day, then just during the night. Okay. And then you still can't run away from the fact that you still need to have all of these big commercial spaces. So what we did was we put them up on stilts. And so the idea was that you would have fine grained 2-story shop houses below, and the coarser big box items are basically hovering above. And we tried to shape and sculpt the massing of these buildings. So for example, this big box contained theater, event spaces, co-live, co-work spaces, and we made the effort to create a terracing, this kind of terracing form. Okay, this kind of terracing form where you can use it as outdoor meeting areas, for outdoor meeting rooms for the co-work spaces. You'll see break areas and so forth. And then when you link all of the roofs of all of these shop houses together, we basically also proposed to have a bridge that went across the street and linked to the adjacent hill park. And so here you can see also we tried to apply a similar principle for the residential towers, where they're basically lifted up off the ground to allow the landscape to crawl underneath. So next, I'd like to talk about the town scale, where I'd like to talk about housing. We've done quite a bit of work in public housing over the past 10 years, and the way these towns respond to what I like to call the greens and the blues, okay? So I like to tell visitors who come to Singapore that places like Orchard Road and Marina Bay, that's not the real Singapore. The real Singapore, in my opinion, can be found in the HDB towns, or the towns which have been developed by the Housing and Development Board, Singapore's public housing agency. And in 60 years, they have developed 24 towns all over Singapore. Within these 24 towns, more than 80% of Singapore's resident population live. And when we consider that the fact that Singapore has the third highest home ownership rate in the world, and of which more than 80% is public housing, it is impossible to deny what an achievement that is. So for Singapore, public housing has been transformative both to the development of the city and the building of the nation. One of the key points that I wish to make regarding housing in Singapore is how it is viewed as what I would like to call an integrated living solution. So to illustrate this point, let me share with you about the town that I live in, from where I'm doing this webinar. It's in a town in the northeast of Singapore called Sengkang. It's about 12.85 kilometers from the downtown core. It's also worth noting that the density of Sengkang works out to about 43 plus square meters per person. Remember, I said in the beginning, Manila is about 48 square meters per person. So for reference purposes, it's comparable to projects 6 to 8 in Quezon City, okay, in its distance to the CBD, okay. And there is Sengkang here is Sengkang side by side with Quezon City project 6 to 8. So comparable in size and distance, okay. Now, let me illustrate what I mean by the integrated living solution. Amongst the different types of housing that we have in this town, public, private apartments, landed houses, etc., here's how it's been planned. So here's the boundary of the town. You have an MRT line running north-south of town. So of course, the train station is in the middle, and they have a light rail network that basically serves the entire town. Then you have the rivers and the waterways, which are maintained by the Public Utilities Board. Then you basically have parks, which are many of which are next to the rivers, maintained by the National Parks Board. You have schools, public schools, secondary and primary schools. Okay, you have a library. You have another set of green spaces. You have another set of green spaces managed by the Public Housing Board. Okay, you have community centers. I was showing you Rivervale a while ago. This is where Rivervale is. Okay, you have a hospital. Then you have places of worship. So these are Chinese temples, Indian temples, churches for Christians, because Singapore is a multi-religious society. And then you have neighborhood centers where you have you can get daily provisions like supermarkets, place to eat, and so on and so forth. And this illustrates the idea of housing in Singapore. The idea of housing should not be just about pabahay. Fundamentally, it should be about pabuhay. It should answer questions like, how do I go to and from work? How do my kids go to and from school? Where do we go for recreation? And so on and so forth. And that takes us basically to the next part, which is the greens and the blues. And I'd like to use this by briefly sharing about Singapore's newest town. It's called Tengah. The media have called it Singapore's greenest project yet. It's about 7 square kilometers in land area, and when it's completed, it will contain about 42,000 housing units, most of which will be public housing. The town is about 16.6 kilometers away from the city's downtown core, which makes it comparable to Fairview in Quezon City in terms of the distance to the CBD, which is Makati. Size-wise, it's a bit smaller, so you can basically compare the two. Okay. Now, this is the master plan of the town. Okay. And just go through how the town has been planned in structures. First, its edges to the east and west are buffered by greenery, including a forest corridor to the west. Then that's the green. Then the north to the south, north and south, you have bodies of water. Okay, you have a stream and a pond, which are blues. These water bodies are actually linked to nearby water bodies, including the Jurong Lake to the south, if you guys are familiar with Singapore. This is another similarity that Tengah House has with Fairview. It's not too different from the fact that Fairview is actually not too far from the La Mesa watershed, right? And then here's the other thing. You actually have a network of linear parkways that basically link all of the greens and the blues together. And you notice that each of the individual plots of land are basically plugged into one of these farmways. So that's how you basically connect the town together. Now, let me go through each of these components. The town center is there in yellow. So when you talk about the greens, the thing is the forest corridor. So the forest corridor here, this is about 5 kilometers long, 100 meters wide. So a part, of course, it can be romantic with all of these images, but it's actually also a very, very clever way of buffering the rest of the town from the expressway that is actually directly adjacent to it. So those are the greens. Now, when we go to the blues, which are the waterways, okay, it is common that people introduce bodies of waters in master plans because they think it looks cool or it looks nice. In the case, this is not the case here. Here, the waterways are actually the natural low-lying areas of the town. They are the natural catch basins of Mother Nature that has bestowed on the site. And so what they have just done with the master plan is take these low-lying water, these are the naturally floodable areas. They left it as green and basically did some park upgrades in order to keep it also as a natural amenity. And then the farmways play the critical role of linking all of the green and blue elements together. They are the green activity corridors for people to walk, jog, cycle, and have community activities on the ground. But beneath, they also feed the water bodies with their stormwater runoff. So that's another purpose of it. And then the town center itself is designed as what they call a car-free marketplace. The master plan has been announced to the media and put up for public exhibition. So it's a very, very transparent process. So hindi ka pwedeng to say, so we avoid situations like, akala ko dapat park dyan. Bakit all of a sudden si ganito at ganyan may bahay doon na dapat park? Okay. Now, in 2017, we would ourselves be given the opportunity to work on one of the first public housing sites in Tengah. It is this wedge-shaped plot at the southeastern area of the town in a neighborhood which they have designated as the Plantation District. So when we develop site planning options, I'll do a quick zoom in. We normally start with models. So they're very, very tactile. So what we normally do is we build the models, we just take foam board, we paste it, and then we get the density right, and then we play Godzilla. We basically twist and turn the models around to try to see what are the best possibilities. It is only after we do all of these physical models, then we do the virtual model. And the important thing about doing the virtual model is not so that you can do the perspective on SketchUp. It's so that you can basically test the idea. If you can test the idea for certain performance standards. So in our case, because our site, if you could see here in the model, there's actually a viaduct in here. This is an MRT viaduct. So our key criteria for this project was, how do we basically mitigate or minimize the impact of the noise for the viaduct into the project itself? So what we did was we basically ran it through simulations. And the scheme that eventually won out was the one that tested the best in terms of buffering the noise impact from the train station. So thus dictated our site planning approach. So you can have here the MRT. This is one of the farmways that I was talking about. So the idea was to place a multi-story car park facing the MRT to buffer off the noise. And then you basically carve out your greenery as an extension or as a branch of the linear farmway. And only after all of these negative spaces or the green spaces are established, dun lang kami maglalagay ng building. So we basically lay out the building, and then we start to break it up into different courtyards, define the spaces a little bit better. So here we opted for a design with 2 linked courtyards, and then we played around with the massing of the building. And that led to the site plan, where you have 2 courtyards linked to each other with a multi-story car park in front. Now, the other thing that we also tried to do was this is a public housing estate. Everything is fully open. There are no fences, there are no walls, there are no gates. So then we expect that the public should be able to filter through the ground plane. The MRT station is in here. There's an adjacent bus stop. So what we did was we created a network of sheltered linkways for people to be able to, weather protected and barrier free, which is our term for handicap friendly. People can connect from the bus stop and go to the MRT station through the park environment of this public housing estate. Now, a while ago, I was talking about building a car light society. So we asked ourselves, we are building a public housing estate that is next to an MRT station. And this multi-story car park is going to have hundreds of cars parked in there. So the logical thing is that the residents of public housing next to an MRT station would probably be the first guys to let their cars go. So what we designed for a multi-story car park where the first story is configured such that we can activate it in the future to convert the space into a community facility, whether it could be a childcare center in the future or a senior activity center, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, the other thing about Tanga, which is a bit of a challenge, is that it is not too far away from the airbase. So one of the things that the housing board did was they basically started to worry about noise. So what they basically tested, these are the physical mock-ups, I'll zoom in, of the things that they have built on Tanga itself, mock-ups of the units to basically test out what kind of window configuration will result in noise reduction. And their standard is dapat nakabukas yung bintana, because they wanted that people still can open their windows to use natural ventilation. So they had this detail that also required, they kailangan daw double layers in windows, so 2 sets of window panels. And then they basically had the side wall and a very, very heavy looking canopy. That's a requirement now. That's one of the things that we needed now to use for a project to mitigate the noise of military aircraft near the airbase. Okay. So what we did was we started to play around with this, and because we were not happy na magmumukhang mabigat yung itsura ng building if we use this. So what we did was to play around with it, and what we did was we took the columns that are normally inside the unit and we basically pushed them out. So it means that these columns siya yung magiging side wall ng bintana. So in a way, that's one function. But the columns can also be used to structurally support these long canopies, which the sound barrier required. So double purpose na siya. Diba? But by pushing the columns out, we then reconfigured the plan such the entire space inside the unit can be entirely column-free. So then we have triple purpose na. Diba? And if you look at it in section, it's actually a sunshade. So that's four in one purpose na. And then, pero di pa tapos. Then we said, okay, let's use this to create the facade concept. Now, you will recall I said we were designing this in a neighborhood that they said needed to be in the plantation theme. So we basically used this. We took inspiration from the very, very regimented appearance of plantations and basically applied a grid on the facade. And that basically generated the overall facade concept of the project. Okay. Plantation acres will also be the first ever one of the first residential plots, never mind public housing, okay, to adopt the use of a centralized cooling system similar to what we see in office buildings. So the basic principle is some of the blocks will have a chiller plant on the roof. And the chilled water will have to travel through the linkways that I was talking about earlier that basically link all of the blocks to each other. So we just have to reconfigure them in order to accommodate the size of all of these big pipes, chilled water pipes to run through. The system is expected to cut energy use by up to 30% and emissions that are equivalent to 4,500 gas-powered cars. So basically, if you're a homeowner, you have the choice of either just going to the furniture store and buying your aircon system, or you just sign up for this and then you just plug into the system and you'll have aircon. So the take-up rate has been very, very encouraging. So this is what the project looks like now. It is under construction. Okay. Next, let's move on to the neighborhood. So the neighborhood scale, I'd like to talk about lungs and permeability. So to discuss this, I'd like to go through one of our projects and how this impacts the neighborhood scale. So recently, the Housing Board in Singapore introduced adding a neighborhood. They announced plans of adding a neighborhood into a town here called Tampines. And the neighborhood would be organized around what they call a boulevard park. And this boulevard park would link all the way to their town center. So in 2016, we won the design competition for the largest park-facing parcel of the neighborhood. It will have nearly 2,200 units. So with one side of the site already having frontage to the 600 plus meter frontage to the park, we basically said we'll introduce our own internal boulevard park of our own, and then we'll create another green connection that basically bisects the site. Okay, and then we didn't want it to be just the daanan, we wanted it to be a proper space defined by buildings. Okay, and this space would be defined, and then the other thing that we thought about was how do we manage the relationship between our site and the boulevard park. So we thought about this idea of having activity nodes. And so what we wanted to do was we basically have these activity nodes, and these activity nodes will be defined by introducing clusters of buildings that embrace these nodes. And then from there, if you're taking your bicycle or if you're jogging along the boulevard park and you're going home, you basically enter through these nodes and basically take you back to the clusters of buildings that are further behind. And when we shaped it in 3D, we felt that each one we wanted to basically step down. This is a maximum height of 14 stories, stepping down to about 5 stories. So basically it steps down. And this idea of entering each cluster, we wanted to introduce a gateway into each node. So then this is what the site plan looks like. 19 residential towers all in all. Okay, here you basically have a cluster of residential, commercial facilities, childcare center, and so on and so forth. And then here are your activity nodes overlapping with that of the park. And so as we envisioned it, it would look like this. So normally in Singapore, public housing estates, the elderly, they form groups, they do their Tai Chi in the morning. Yung mga mas hip, they will do things like line dancing in the afternoon. So we envision that these sorts of spaces are suitable for those kinds of activities. Right, and then as you go through, each one will basically have a portal. And when you enter the portal, you enter a double volume community living room space. It's like a lobby. And then that's how you go home if you live in this block. Or if you live at the blocks behind, you can take the landscape staircase to basically go through the gardens, elevated gardens at the back. Here at the back is car parking. Or kung tinatamad ka, you go to this block, you take the lift up, you can also get there. Okay. So because the site is very, very long, it's about 600 meters long, clustering is very, very important. So what we did was we basically applied a color code so that you basically have a sense of identity. Okay, and what we did was we basically tied this together with the landscape architect. So the landscape architect is Site Concepts International. They have an office in the Philippines. The landscape designer for this project is also a Filipino architect. So I enjoyed my working experience with him. So he basically introduced a different theme for each of these nodes, and even the landscape selection. So you see, as you go through each of the nodes, you have different plant species. Each place looks different, has a different color, has a different smell, has a different experience. Okay, I think finally when we go through the last thing I want to talk about neighborhood is the creation of walkable and bikeable neighborhood streets. So first, this is a photograph of the neighborhood where I used to live. So I'll just let you guys imagine. In Manila, if this thing here was a restaurant, you would imagine that this whole thing, lahat yan parking, and then people are just coming out of the roads and there'll be chaos, traffic. And imagine like places like Panawe and things like that. No? So in Singapore, bawal yan. Okay, in Singapore, every site is designated a point of ingress and egress into the site. And that's the only point where your cars can come in and out. If you need any kind of vehicular circulation in your site, you have to provide it in your site that is completely separate from your road access, and the LTA decides where your road access is. Okay. Now apart from that, okay, so you also are required to provide what's called in Singapore as a green buffer. So the green buffer is determined by the category, the road category which you're fronting. Sometimes this thing needs to be wider. Minimally, it needs to be 2 meters. Sometimes it goes up to 5 or more. Okay. So what you put in the green buffer is also controlled by the planning authorities. For instance, if you have things like cable services running underneath it, it cannot be, it must be below 2 meters, because they want minimum 2 meters of soil depth so that you can plant trees in these green buffers. And the species of trees you need to submit it to the National Parks Board kasi gusto nila shade-giving plants. Okay, so everything on the right side of the yellow line is actually the property of this estate. Everything on the left side, that's part of the right of way of LTA already. And then LTA plants their own trees. So what do you get? Okay, you get a sidewalk which is shaded on both sides with trees. And when you basically upgrade it, you can actually introduce things like designated bike paths. This is also part of the neighborhood that I used to live in. Okay, I used to live not far from here. This is a photograph that I took from one of my walks. Okay. So finally, I'd like to go into the building scale. Okay. I'd like to talk about a few different principles which we use for the design of buildings. First, I'd like to talk about the principle of facing the right way. People first principle, which I think Roy touched on it earlier on, where we can get design inspiration from. Next is the importance of buildings that breathe. And finally, I'd like to talk about touching the ground lightly. Okay. So what is facing the right way? Where do you face the right way? Right way is, of course, north-south. Okay. And I'm surprised by, I have friends who ask me, I have friends and relatives who show me condominium units that they're thinking of buying, and they show me the plans asking me if it's a good buy or not. And I'm horrified by how badly many developers in the Philippines get this. Ang daming east-west facing buildings in the Philippines. Okay. Now, I'll just show a little point in here. Okay, in Singapore, this is not just an archy thing or you're being a tree hugger. This is a real estate property thing. Okay, so I'll give you an example. This is in propertyguru.com, which is a real estate portal in Singapore. A guy selling his 1-bedroom apartment. Okay, so it's 40 plus square meters only, 725 Sing dollars. That's about 26 million pesos. Yes, ganyan kamahal ang property here in Singapore. But let's look at the selling points. Okay. Selling points na including high floor, block 8, swerte daw yung number, bright and windy. Okay? Kasama rin dyan, no afternoon sun. Okay? So it's already integrated and embedded into the values of the property market. And I think that is something I think that is very, very important if you want to talk about living and sustainably making people less reliant on air conditioning. Okay? So now, from here, I'll take you to a project that we did. This is once again a public housing project that we did. This is Clementi Cascadia. Okay, so you can see here the buildings are predominantly north-south. They're north-south in orientation. But I'd like to also highlight another principle that we keep at heart, and that is people first. Okay, now for those who have been to this part of Singapore, okay, or if not, this corner, this intersection is a very, very prominent corner because it is right next to the town mall and the MRT station. So this is one of the most distinctive, prominent corners of the site. And then if you're an egomaniac architect, if you're an egomaniac, you'll say, I want to plonk an iconic building in here. It's a landmark building. And we wanted to basically stop ourselves from such impulses. We said that this space in here must be an open space, and it must be a receiving point for residents who are walking home from the MRT station. And what we did to do that was we needed to sculpt the multi-story car park because below all of this is car parking. So what we did was, okay, we had to design it by burying the car park underneath. So here's what we did. So basically was to do the car park in a series of landscape terraces that are linked by a series of ramps and staircases. So as you walk from one tier to the other, you encounter all the different recreational amenities in the landscape. Okay. So this is what we envision it. This is the perspective during the launch by the Public Housing Board. This is how it looked like when it was newly completed. By now, if you go there, the trees are much more fully grown. We worked with a landscape architect, also a Filipino landscape architect. Okay, so the idea was to kind of soften the edges of the car park, and the idea was to use the ramps and the staircases to create those soft edges. And here's thing about design inspiration. What we did was we took inspiration from the site itself. So one of the things we noticed about the site was that the site's topography actually swirled. It wasn't straight, hindi siya straight. The topography actually swirled upwards. And we said, there's a pretty interesting thing about this site. So let's reflect this thing that nobody will see on the ground. Let's reflect it in the skyline. And that's why the buildings actually have that kind of swirling skyline, and we try to exaggerate it by sloping the roofs. Okay, and when we slope the roofs to express the idea, okay, so that we tested it first with scale models. Okay, this is the project launch perspectives, and this is the project completed. Now, from here, I'll go to the principle of buildings that breathe. First, I'll talk about it in terms of our applications of it in public housing. So you'll notice that we also, in public housing, we have no choice but to control the amount of glazing that we provide, okay? So what is important is how and where we provide it. So what we do for public housing is that if you look at it, okay, if you look at it, we basically provide a 300 mm canopy jutting out. Then you have an operable casement window. You have an operable casement window, and above it, you have a top-hung window. And the reason why we use this detail is that homeowners who opt not to air condition their homes, what they can do is they can, on a rainy day, kasi ang kawawa, parang sayang naman, malamig yung panahon, rainy day, pero you can't open the windows kasi papasok yung ulan. So the idea is on rainy day, you close your casement window, you open the top-hung window, you get the weather protection unless the rain is super crazy. Then, but most of the time you're able to allow the breeze to come in, and you still have enough weather protection. Okay, and then what we did was we also played around with the unit plans. So a typical configuration looks like this. You have the living room in front, the dining room at the back, and so so we said, okay, let's play around with it. We tried to do this thing that was very, very rarely done in public housing in Singapore. We rotated the entire living dining room so that the whole thing has wide frontage, enjoying the views, but at the same time, the depth of the spaces, hindi siya malalim. You can basically allow the air circulation, doesn't have to go too deep. So you apply this to all the unit types in this particular project. Okay. Now, this idea of buildings that breathe, we kind of took it up one step to the extreme in a project we did in 2013. So it was a finalist in the 2013 World Architecture Festival Awards. So this is Essentia Sky. This is a private condominium here in Singapore. So what we did was we started this idea of doing 2 conventional towers with stacked units. So that's the plan, that's in section. And then what we then started to do was we started to insert units in between the towers. So, and then after that, the space between these units we inserted the towers, we started to insert gardens. So to give you a detailed plan of what this looks like, I'll show you what it looks like. So you have the plan here on the left side, you have the section on the right side. So what happens with this building is that as you go up, so you can see here, sometimes the units in the middle, they're diagonally across each other. They basically, these guys sometimes have a view in front, sometimes a view, and sometimes the units are side by side each other. So what happens is that the building, basically, as you climb up the building, and every now and then we'll insert a garden, okay? You have this variety of spaces as you basically climb up and crawl up the building, okay? And so the result in section, you get a building where you have these various gardens inserted at various levels. And so we did a calculation. Our tower footprint is about 2,032 square meters, which means that by putting the tower, we deprive the site of 2,000 plus square meters of greenery. But with more than 5,400 square meters of green space added through these gardens, I'd say that we more than made up for it. Okay, so these are what the gardens look like today. Okay, and designing the facade was not difficult. We just had to express these boxes, these modules that we basically inserted through. Okay. And then this idea of buildings that breathe, we basically also took it further. So even things like service areas, bathrooms, which I think in most apartment designs we leave to mechanical ventilation. We've naturally ventilated bathrooms. We naturally ventilated kitchens and clothes drying yards and things like that. We basically naturally ventilated these kinds of spaces in this building, and that's Essentia Sky. The next thing I want to talk about is touching the ground lightly. This is more about kind of trying to be as respectful to the natural assets of a site as possible. And I'm reminded of this. This is Bartley Residences. This is one of the most technically difficult projects that I've worked on. It was difficult because, number one, you could see the profile of the site, baku-baku yung site, okay? And the second was because the site had a natural topography difference of about almost 20 meters from one end to the other. And then we found out that we had a 147-year-old body tree in the middle of the site that the National Parks Board told us we are required to preserve. So when the tree was so sensitive that the consultant team we needed to have an arborist on board for the project. And before the site was officially handed over to the developer, the National Parks Board, they brought their own arborist. So our arborist and their arborist, they had to go to the tree together, inspect the tree together. They spoke to the tree and they spoke their tree language. But the goal was essentially to establish that the tree was in good health. And therefore, if anything happened to the tree, lagot kaming lahat. So we basically studied various site planning options for the project. So I think the logical thing was that we had one open space that basically clustered around the tree and another open space clustered around the swimming pool. And this is the site plan that we eventually went to. So this is the thing when we simulated it on 3D. This was the marketing brochure plan. And this was how we envisioned it. We envisioned putting the children's playground underneath the tree because the tree canopy was so wide, it could cast a shadow and it would be comfortable to use that space every time of day because of how the shading that you got. And so what had to happen was that all of these footpaths needed to be ramps because also of the topography. Anyway, to cut the suspense short, here the tree is, it survived, okay? You can see here how we try to be respectful with the terrain. You can see here, the apartments here these buildings are sitting at significantly higher level than this thing. So the first story apartments here basically are looking at a sunken landscape courtyard. You can see here, we had to do the landscape in tiers. The challenging part was managing the topography, and basically, as you can imagine, the solution that we adopted was to have a 25-meter no-build zone around the tree. So the car park basement is a very, very interesting floor plan that unfortunately I'm not allowed to show you guys. Okay, so the next thing that we need to do, of course, was to use the topography of the site to create a very, very interesting experience. So what we did was, if you drove up to the site, so this would be the drop-off porch, you arrived at the landscape pavilion. And if you got off the landscape pavilion, you would end up in here. And if you walk towards the end of the landscape pavilion, you would find that this pavilion is basically perched over the swimming pool. And we designed the pool to appear as if it was like cracked open from the ground. Okay, and so that idea of the drop-off pavilion perched over the pool looked like this. This is the brochure perspective. I'm happy to say that we were able to execute our vision. Okay, this is the pool. Okay, as per done in the marketing perspective. The car parking is behind these fountains. Okay, and this is what it looks like during the daytime. Okay, and this is what it looks like during the nighttime. Okay. Now, the buildings, as they were arranged facing the street, we also tried to be sensitive. We did not want them to appear like a wall. The street is quite busy, so what we did was we did a very, very gentle kind of like twisting and turning of the building so that, number one, you also mitigate the feeling of being head-on to the street and basically absorbing all the noise and dust from the street, that kind of having a little bit of subtle tilting away. And I think we were able to very, very successfully achieve that. Okay. Now, I'll finish off with this project recently completed. This is called Twin View. It's a much smaller project, and it was a very, very simple approach that we took. And we basically said to ourselves when we started to work on this project was that it was important to us that when you look at the first story plan, it was important to us that you would not be able to tell where the building was. And I'm happy to report that we were able to achieve that. So whereas the buildings here, you have to look at the white dots. The white dots, that's where the columns are. So the towers were built on stilts, and the idea, similar to Holland, was to allow the Holland Village proposal earlier, was to allow the landscape to seamlessly crawl underneath the building. And so that we can have this idea of a resort style landscape kind of crawling through at the ground plane. And above, it's a very, very mechanical approach, because this building adopts the use of concrete PPVC, that Lego style block that I was talking about. And the key to doing that is to basically very, very neatly line up your plans. Okay, so when we did that, the thing to be mindful of is the size of each module. And the size of each module had to be configured such that you avoid needing to activate, having to provide police escort for your components being brought from the warehouse to the construction site. But what about luxurious apartments like this? This is the biggest of the unit types that they have in Twin View, where you have this big, expansive and luxurious living dining room. So what we did was we did a hybrid system. So the bedrooms and so forth, they basically used the PPVC, and we did cast in situ conventional construction for these big spaces. Okay, so these are photographs of the completed project. You can see here that the landscape is very, very naturally, seamlessly crawling and flowing through the underside of the buildings. Okay, so these are other pictures. I'll finish off with a video recently done by the developer. Lower the volume. Okay. You can see the roofs are also landscape, an amenity for the residents to enjoy. Pavilions, the landscape coming in tiers. Medyo cheesy lang that they chose not to spell view the correct way. This is the drop-off, and when you get up the drop-off, you walk in and you appear into a sunken courtyard, and you take the staircase up to the landscape deck. You can see there the building on stilts, how tall the voluminous space are. That's the clubhouse. You can see we tried to kind of embed it into one of the tiers of the landscape. Public spaces for residents, outdoor fitness corners at the roof. This is what the penthouse unit looks like, overlooking the Ulu Pandan Reservoir here in Singapore. Yeah, they came back and shot it at night as well, just to see how the lighting for the landscape worked out. So that's the same experience when you drop off. and you climb up to that sunken courtyard through to the landscape deck. And this is a pavilion, so you can wait for your taxi. If he's taking forever, you can sit there and wait for him to come. The effect of the lighting casting shadows on the other side of the tower. When we light the buildings, we of course try to light up the roof, because sometimes we light the body of the building, and this Norway, and we try to emphasize the lighting more on the public areas. I think for today, I'd just like to finish with a quote from the great Greek philosopher Socrates. By far the greatest and most admirable form of wisdom is what is needed to plan and beautify cities and human communities. And I think for us in our profession, in the built environment, we are very, very much part of this project. So thank you and Merry Christmas to all.